In general, the reason we write is because we have something to communicate. It may be something that's deeply personal and urgent to us, or it may be something that we've been asked to write by a boss, or probably if you're watching this video, an instructor. In this video, I'm going to talk to you briefly about some principles of writing about other people's writing, both when you do literary analyses in English classes and also when you incorporate sources from other writers so that your own writing will be richer and more fully informed. The first crucial principle you need to bear in mind is to think of writing as a conversation. When you write a paper in my class, you are communicating with me much as you would communicate with me in dialogue in class, except that in this case your writing is a little more formal, you have more time to think about it and to prepare it, and you'll be submitting it to me in written form, where instead of responding to it directly, I as well have time to think about it before I respond to you. So although you won't be using the same language or rhetoric as you might use in a formal conversation, still think about me as an audience. When you get to other writing projects later, think about the eventual audience. What response do you want your reader to have? What do you want them to think about as a result of the information you've provided? And, most importantly, what would be the most effective writing method to get your ideas across? Think of writing as a conversation. In fact, many people say that when you're responding to another text, you should think of writing as a party, and that's nowhere more true than when you're writing about someone else's writing, and particularly when you're writing about someone else's writing and using other sources along the way. If I want to write a text about Shakespeare, I don't want to write my text about Shakespeare in isolation. I want to know what other people have thought about Shakespeare. And before I join the conversation, I would want to read some of their ideas and make sure that I was really informed on the topic before I submitted my work. The same is kind of true if I go to a party. If I'm late to the party and everyone is already having a conversation when I arrive, I don't just walk up to a group of people and start talking about whatever I feel like talking. I'll probably stand at the edge of the group and listen to the conversation and see what they're talking about before I decide whether I want to participate in the conversation or whether I want to move on to a different group. In this instance, the longer I listen to the conversation, the better informed I'll be able to be when I actually choose to speak, or, to make my metaphor more simple, when I actually choose to write the paper. If I've read the primary text, that's an important start to joining the conversation. If I've listened to one or two other people's ideas, which is the equivalent of reading one or two other articles on the particular topic, then I also have other ideas I can bring in to make those other people feel more included. Similarly, if I'm at a party and everyone is talking about my favorite book, I don't want to summarize that book as I jump into the conversation. Since most of the people in that conversation seem to have read the book, instead, I want to jump in with my ideas about the book, depending on the trend of the conversation, or, in your case, depending on the scope of your assignment. So similarly, in your own paper, don't summarize the short story or the poem or the other literary text you're writing about. Your reader, your instructor, the other person in your conversation already knows the plot, and you won't need to bore your reader with that. That doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't give helpful references to points in the story, so you can say, after Jimmy goes to the store, and then explain the point that you want to make, or even, when Susan says this, and then explain why that's an important statement for her, but you want to avoid having one or more paragraphs that simply restate the plot from beginning to end. That's not a conversation. There are also some other quirks that are unlike going to a party. When we write about other writing, we always speak of the authors using their last name. Now, the first time you name an author, you'll want to use both names. And that's because if you just say something like Brown says, or even Acker says, your reader might not be sure which Brown or which Acker you're talking about. So the first time you give a source, you'll want to look at the way your author has written his or her name on the text that you're reading, and then introduce that author. Use their full name, and also give just a clause of identifying information, possibly that establishes their authority, but certainly that gives your reader a sense of who that person is, and then launch into your description from the article or the source. In subsequent moments, when you refer to the author, you don't need a title like Mr. or Dr., and you don't even need their first name unless for some reason it's important to distinguish one author from another. Instead, you'll just call that author by their last name. So if you were describing me in an article, you'd look at the way that I wrote my name on the article. I usually do Faith D. Acker to distinguish myself from the other Faith Ackers out there. You would not say Dr. Faith Acker, although you could say Faith D. Acker, professor at Southeastern Louisiana University. After you'd introduced me that first time, each other time you referred to me, you would just call me Acker. You wouldn't call me Dr. Acker or Mrs. Acker, just plain Acker, and that takes the focus away from my gender and my academic credentials and focuses it on the argument that you're interacting with. Each time you refer to an author, you'll want to use these same principles, whether it's the primary author of a text that you're writing about or analyzing, or whether it's the author of a secondary source that you're using to enrich your argument. Each time, introduce the author, explain why they're credible or important or relevant, and then in subsequent references refer to them just by their last name. Something else that you'll want to do that is unique to an academic written essay is use quotation marks for anything you quote from an author. This doesn't have to be a full sentence or even a whole clause. Sometimes if one or two words that you're quoting are so important that you need to use those precise terms, you'll want to put just that one word or one phrase in quotation marks and cite the page number to show your reader that those words specifically belong to the author that you're citing. Even when you paraphrase ideas from an author, again, whether it's the author of the text that you're analyzing or someone who's written a source that's helped you understand it, you'll want to cite that author even if you've paraphrased those ideas in your own words. Attributing sources is an important part of participating in the academic conversation, both for showing that you're already well read and established within the conversation, and for giving credit to the other valid and important people that are discussing the text with you. They will probably not respond to you, although they could someday, but it's important to give credit where credit is due. Finally, the last rule that I'd like to give you, and this is true both for conversations that you might have socially and also for the written conversations I'd like you to imagine having on the pages of your essay, is to treat the other authors with respect. This doesn't mean that you have to agree with the other authors. In fact, you may disagree vehemently with another author, and that's fine. It could make for a very exciting essay. However, it's crucial that you treat that other person with respect because the authors of the texts that you're reading are still human beings. They're still worthy of civil language, and when you criticize them, you still want to make sure that you're doing it with concrete examples and not ad hominem attacks or slurs. This is not only an important part of academic discourse, but an important part of human conversations, and more than anything, an important part of being a human in this world.